There's an old line that goes something like, the Italians invented the sports sedan, the Germans perfected it, and the Japanese figured out how to make it affordable. Now, like all good lines, it's a little bit true, a little bit hyperbole. But let's stop on that middle part for a bit, the German part. And this car in particular, the legendary E30 chassis M3, the first BMW M3, the one they built for the diehards. The story of this car is rooted in how German companies think. For decades, BMW did affordable, lively, fun little sedans. Mercedes-Benz did the same idea, but more durable, rooted in a certain sort of stoicism, more calm. In the early 1980s, Mercedes decided it wanted to get into Group B FIA rally racing. They paid Cosworth to develop a 16-valve head for one of their small sedans, developed the car, put it together, and then for a bunch of reasons didn't end up going into Group B. They looked at what it had, realized it would work really well in FIA touring car racing, and went that direction. At BMW, because the Germans watch everything that happens across town, across the country, Audi, Mercedes, BMW, looking at each other, trying to figure out how to outgame the other one while also not falling behind, BMW looked at what Mercedes was doing and thought, we gotta get on this. Gotta have something for this. Gotta fight them. So in a really short amount of time, they spun up this. This is a 4-cylinder, 2.3-liter, 195 horsepower rear-wheel drive sports sedan. It is also the winningest touring car in history, one of the winningest race cars in history, one of the most balanced road cars or race cars ever made, and a perfect example of what the Germans do well when they put their minds to something. So the first generation M3 was launched globally in 1986, but it didn't come to the American market until 1988. It was sold here from 1988 until 1991, and generally speaking, although there were rolling changes, there were two generations of sort. Early cars have a non-airbag steering wheel and pop-out recorder windows, like this one. Late cars have an airbag steering wheel and fixed rear quarters. Beyond that, the main thing you need to look for is that the car is complete. There's an awful lot of stuff here that makes these things special. We're focusing on the American market here. There are a bunch of special editions and other motors in other markets, but much of the information we'll go over here will apply to standard 3 Series. It should be pretty obvious where not. Where this car is similar to an ordinary 3 Series, it is very similar, sometimes identical. Where it's different, it is very different, sometimes so different that the parts are non-recognizable. It's worth thinking about. So the engine is one of the neatest parts of the car. It's a 2.3-liter, 7,200 RPM, 195 horsepower 4-cylinder. It has its roots in BMW's Formula One program. The engine block has ties there and all the way back to BMW's 2002 of the 1960s. It's extremely durable and not uncommon to see these cars with 200,000 or 300,000 miles on them. But that generally comes with a deep attention to maintenance. This car has shim over bucket lifters and requires valve adjustments every 30,000 miles. They matter. If it's been tracked, you'll want to check that the rod bearings have been looked at regularly because it'll wipe them and eventually pitch a rod through the block if ignored. There's nothing complicated here, but the parts can get expensive. Timing chain, for example, it's generally believed to have about an 80 to 100,000 mile life. Somewhere around there, you're gonna have to do timing chain reels. Valve adjustments are important. They need to be done roughly every 30,000 miles. If you don't, valve clearances open up, impacts how the motor runs. Details matter here. When you're looking under the hood, look to make sure there are no wrinkles behind the strut towers. Check under the fuse box for rust. Check the front frame rails to make sure they're not wrinkled from an impact. There's a lot of detail work here. The motors are durable, but the cars are so durable around that motor that they tended to be abused and ignored for a long time. There's a big gulf between the two classes of E30 M3. On one end, you have the cars that got everything they ever needed, and then you have the cars that were abused and driven into the ground. And as values have risen, it's become less and less common to see cars in this end of the spectrum, but that doesn't mean that they weren't dragged up into the middle and got a lot of latter-day maintenance. Just be careful. Factory pistons are $400 a piece. Lower timing chain rails are $500 a piece. These are things that you need in a rebuild, and while they're available, They're not cheap. Even a stock rebuild can be $15,000 to $20,000. More if you want to get any power out of it, and the more power you want, the more expensive it gets. There are a handful of mods in the motor that you'll commonly see. Most people will put an engine management chip in. This is common largely because our fuel and ignition curves in this market were relatively conservative. A chip here can make a big difference, assuming it came from somebody who knew what they were doing. Pretty common for people to build a 2.5 liter out of the 2.3. In Europe, there was a model called the Sport Evolution. We didn't get it. It had a 2.5 liter. It made around 240 horsepower. The bits to make that motor from the factory are still available, but they can get expensive. And it can cost $30,000 or $40,000 to do that motor right, to make a clone of a 2.5. In the end, you'll be spending an awful lot of money for not a lot of power. Many people have built 2.5 clones or something like it. In that case, what you're worried about isn't so much the fact that it was done, but the fact that it was done right. There are a lot of half-baked 2.5s running around that make a decent amount of power and were built by somebody who just kind of put all the parts together in one pile. Doesn't mean it's a bad idea, it just means that you should know what you're buying when you get it. Find out who built the motor, figure out what's inside it before you sign a check. So in the American market, these cars were equipped a little bit differently. They all came with a premium stereo, they all came with power windows, they all came with a sunroof, and it was power at that. A lot of that stuff got thrown away in period for people to make track cars. A lot of the specific interior trim, the black headliner, the black C-pillar covers, is no longer available from the factory, expensive, or just plain hard to get. When you're looking at one of these things, interior completeness is paramount. Not because you can't find it, but because when you do find it, it's going to be a used part that's probably going to be pretty expensive. Now this car has a handful of things that aren't stock. The steering wheel, the shift knob. This was originally a one-piece mushroom-shaped knob that was integral with the boot, went NLA for a long time. Now, those things aren't critical, obviously, but there are a lot of things here that if you're looking at a car that was converted back from a track car or a race car, might not be present. The C-pillar covers, a lot of the small trim bits, the radios. These things can be difficult to find used and or not in great shape, and while they made a lot of these cars, the M3 specific trim isn't readily available. Common problems: the dashes crack, the leather's relatively long-lived, but the bolsters wear. If it's not conditioned, it tends to tear, come apart. The seats are unique to the car. The rear seats are unique to the car. You can't get the rear seat anymore. The front seats look like 325i seats, but the stitching is different. It's horizontal instead of vertical. If a car's been reupholstered, sometimes those details won't be done right. Sometimes they won't be done at all. Be careful. If you're looking at a car that's had its interior out or replaced, or a track car that's been converted back to stock use, do your homework or pay the price. Now, much of what makes these cars different from a standard 3 Series is under the skin, but a lot of it is easily visible. These fender flares, for example, the sill trim, the trunk lid, the C-pillar, which was reshaped and had a different back glass to channel air over the wing and reduce the coefficient of drag. Bumper skirts are different. The bumper covers in the front are different. None of these things were found on other 3 Series, and it's really difficult to retrofit them onto a standard car. So you're probably not going to come across many clones or stuff passing for an M3 that isn't an actual M3. The problem is finding one of these things that's complete. Many of them were converted to track cars or race cars in period, a practice that still happens today. And because there were only 5,000 of these things in our market and prices have gone up significantly in the past 10 years, a lot of those track cars are being converted back. Interiors that were thrown away are being reassembled from bits. Exterior stuff, a lot of which isn't in production anymore, is having to be found. Make sure the car that you buy is complete. Otherwise, you might go through hell trying to find tiny bits and some unobtainium piece of trim from somewhere, or paying through the nose for it. Now, for the most part, these cars rust in the same places as standard 3 Series, which means the sills, the frame rails, the area behind the taillights, the area under the trunk lid, but there are a couple of things that are unique to E30 M3s. The windshield, unlike on a standard E30, is bonded in place. It means it's glued. This was uncommon at the time, and it helped torsional rigidity. But one of the things that means is that whenever somebody goes to replace the windshield, you have to scrape off the adhesive. You scrape off the adhesive, a lot of times guys will nick the paint, go through the primer, gouge the steel, not fix it. Moisture gets in there, rust starts, builds under the seal. It can be incredibly expensive to fix because then it goes down into the cowl, down into the fenders, down into the A-pillar. Make sure that the car has records. If it's on its original windshield, that's a bonus. You can usually tell there's a logo on it and it won't be in the records. If it has been replaced, however, make sure that it's done right. Most of these cars have had a windshield swapped at some point. It's something to look for. So in America, these cars were sold with a 5-speed overdrive Getrag gearbox. They were not available with an automatic. If you're looking at one in this country, it is probably going to have that gearbox. It was paired with a 410 diff. They're geared relatively short, and they tend to spin a lot of RPM on the freeway. The rest of the world, there was a closed ratio dogleg 5-speed, also a Getrag. Looks very similar, and like this gearbox, tends to weep a little bit of oil. You'll see this one's coated. It's entirely normal. As both of these gearboxes wear, it's not uncommon to see synchro noise. It's not uncommon to see them pop out of gear, but by and large, they're durable if you don't abuse them. A lot of the magic with these cars lies in the suspension balance, and that's a lot of small changes. The struts are different, the sway bar end links are different, bushings are different. There are a lot of tiny changes from the factory that make these cars handle the way they do, and while there's nothing inherently wrong with modifying them, a lot of the mods remove the sweetness and simply add grip. If you're looking at a modified car, be careful. There's nothing wrong with modified E30 M3s, and a large percentage of them were and are continuing to be tracked or even raced, but make sure that the changes that were done to the car suit what you want to do with it. Making them stiffer and less compliant doesn't necessarily make for a better road car. Just turns it into a giant Miata with gobs grip and no motor. This is a perfect example of one of the things that the factory did that makes the car work better that a lot of people throw away and don't think about. This X-pipe here. If the car you're looking at has an aftermarket exhaust, make sure it's there. These days, most of them do, but if it's gone, it can rob power, torque, response. One more small thing. These are cars of details. Every little detail here matters, both cosmetic or in trim or in how the suspension is set up.
Between 2007 and 2013, a 1988 BMW M3 in number 2 excellent condition enjoyed a stable value of around $15,000. By mid-2015, the cars were worth more than twice that, with the number 2 coming in around $44,000. Another surge occurred, however, and values have risen ever since. As of early 2021, a good E30 M3 can command low six figures, with a number 2 excellent example bringing around $102,000 and no let-up in sight. This video review is intended to give an overview of what it's like to buy a first-generation BMW M3, but keep in mind that values change over time. For more details and up-to-date information, click the link below for our full written buyer's guide on Hagerty.com.
When we talk about balance, what we mean is that everything works together well. The car doesn't have too much of anything. It doesn't have too much power, it doesn't have too much grip, it doesn't have too much stiffness in the chassis. Everything talks to you, it feels right. Everything here just works with everything else. And that's so rare. If you don't get it, you'll never get it. And if you drive it hard and don't like it, you're never gonna like it. But if it pushes your buttons, there's nothing else like it.